was frozen out. And then on top of that, last year we saw this awful high-speed rail accident in China that killed about 40 people and injured nearly 200 people. And since then, I've noticed that President Obama hasn't pointed to China's high-speed rail system to talk about building high-speed rail here anymore. I disagree with Obama on a number of things, but sometimes I don't begrudge him on complaining that our infrastructure is crumbling, because we do have a lot of problems with our infrastructure. But the mistake is we shouldn't assume that just because another country is dumping a lot of money on these projects, that that's the way for us to go here. And the rail minister over there was the guy who was seen as the architect of high-speed rail was fired last year because he was doing embezzling. He was part of, he was part of a great deal of corruption, and he was also keeping 18 mistresses. But that kind of stuff is actually quite common in China. Oftentimes you would hear about the fall of some, Communist Party leader or some big shot government official, and you find out not only had they embezzled a whole bunch of money, but they had all these mistresses on the side too. It's almost as if no corrupt politician could be corrupt without a bunch of mistresses. Anyway, but my point is that the free market works in a number of ways. It works because it tells you where the demand is and where the supply should be, and it has a logic of its own. And when the government tells companies or people in a country what to do and how to do it, a lot of times what will end up happening is that people won't know for sure what the demand really is, and they probably won't even really care. And two, there will be, because of the way that China's political system is structured, then you also have a lot of opportunities for corruption. Let me give you another example. This actually goes back to the one-child policy. We've been talking a lot here in this country about the need for renewable energy, and by now everyone knows about the fiasco of having invested government money in Solyndra, which also is not too far away from here. It's just in Fremont, and they went bankrupt after taking about $500 million from Uncle Sam. But one of the reasons we gave so much money to Solyndra was that, at least according to Obama administration officials from the Energy Department, they said, well, our industries need to compete. We can't possibly have our renewable industries compete against China. They're underpricing us, and the Chinese government has given, just in the year 2010 alone, one policy bank in China gave $10 billion to about 5 or 6 solar companies. We only gave Solyndra $500 million. What are you people complaining about? What we don't know is that there's actually a lot of inefficiencies in the Chinese system on renewable energy too. And there's also something really callous about how they describe the whole thing. For instance, China is now the biggest wind producer in the world. That didn't used to be the case. In fact, quite recently that wasn't the case. But one example I like to give is that just because they've built all the windmills in China doesn't mean that all the windmills are in fact being used. And so I believe as of the end of 2010, for instance, a third of China's windmills were standing idle. They were unable to connect to the electric grid. And the reason was because the state said to everybody, we need you to build. That's our directive. Go out and build these windmills. And people did, and in fact this included private sector companies. But then you usually build windmills where there is land. And so we, here in California, you see plenty of windmills on the side of highways, for instance, where there's land available. And so a lot of windmills were built in northern China and in places that were less heavily populated, but most people in China don't live up there, and they live elsewhere, more, certainly definitely on the coast and the east and so on. And there wasn't exactly a way to get the energy get the electricity from northern China, from those windmills to elsewhere, and it sort of goes to show that just because you build something, just because the government tells you to do something, it doesn't mean that it actually works. Certainly China is trying very, very hard to fix this window problem, and I think they've made some progress in recent years, but there's no reason why we should blindly copy their model. Additionally, China's been, and this is actually one of my favorite quotes from a Chinese government official, China likes to brag about its renewable contributions to building green tech and combating climate change. Clearly that's one objective that President Obama has as well, but one Chinese official, she's a top official at the Family Planning Commission, it's the commission that deals with the one-child policy. At one point she said to a reporter, well, we know that global warming is a huge issue. Climate change is something that we take very seriously, and here in China we took some swift action. And as you all know, fewer people means fewer carbon emissions because the more people you have, the more gadgets you use, more cars you drive, and so on, right? And so this woman from this Family Planning Commission said, well, we took some swift action. We have a one-child policy here in China, and so over the last 30 years or so, there have been however many fewer birds. I don't have the exact number here, but there's been like millions and millions fewer birds as a result of that policy, and that can translate into however many hundreds of billions of metric tons of carbon emissions. So see, this is like the great swift action that we've taken here. And only in an authoritarian country would you have a top bureaucrat saying something like that. If anybody attempted to say something like that in a democratic country, he would immediately fired. But usually democratic countries wouldn't give you a reason to say something like that because you wouldn't be doing something like that. So anyway, so this is an example that I like to give just to show that the political restrictions are often very much interlinked with the economic restrictions. The economic restrictions tend to make things very inefficient, and then the political restrictions, when they're applied on top of the economic restrictions, tend to impose a lot of very drastic human costs that no democracy would be willing to undertake. So, yes, sir, before I get to you, let me ask how I'm doing on time. How many? Okay. Yes, sir.
Another thing should be copied from China, but what prevents North Korea from learning from China?
What prevents them from?
Prevents North Korea.
They don't want to. The Chinese have tried. Yes, the Chinese have told North Koreans many times that they should liberalize their economy just like China has, and that it would do them a lot of good. The North Koreans have said, after touring China, have said, no thank you, you guys are not real communists, you're traitors to the communist ideology, we're not going to become like you. Yes?
In the last few months, there's been a lot of news in the media about the horrible working conditions in companies like the Apple companies that make the iPhones and the iPads and all that, where in China they work long, long hours and commit suicide a lot. And I am not an economist, but it is said that if those were manufactured here, because of OSHA rules and minimum wage laws and unions and everything, those things would be priced out of the market and nobody would have them. I presume several people in this room have them with them right now, but they were made under, as I understand it from reading, they're made under almost slave conditions. You're a policy advisor for Parkland. How do you respond to that issue?
Well, I think let me try to parse that out. So the company that you're talking about, Apple's contractor, it's Foxconn. It's a huge Taiwanese company. They've made tons of money in China, precisely serving as the contractor to companies like Apple. And it is true that working conditions in a lot of these Chinese manufacturing companies are very poor. Now, with that said, this does not prevent lots and lots of Chinese people from lining up outside of these companies to ask for jobs. I think there's a difference between companies that use laborers according to the standards that are common in a developing country, because there's no way that Chinese laborers could be paid at the same rate that employees here in the United States would be paid. You're right that they don't have the environmental standards there, they don't have the labor standards there, and so that takes a big chunk out of the cost. And a lot of human rights activists complain that this is exactly what the big, Western multinationals like about China. I think there is a difference between using your employees to give them jobs, give them training, allow them to produce a product, let them do something useful with their lives, and allow them to make some money. There's a difference between doing that, even if at a standard that's much lower than what we have here, but there's a difference between that and actually outright abusing your employees and outright subjecting them to, life-threatening conditions. And so, with Foxconn, they've, Apple's contractor, they've tried to do as much as they can to improve working conditions. They've tried to compensate the families of the employees who've committed suicide. And I think over time, the labor conditions in China will get better because as people become wealthier, they will demand more. In fact, already, I think the new workers in the Chinese marketplace are demanding far higher wages than their parents have. I think it's a process that emerging economies have to go through because you don't get out of poverty by staying on a farm. The way that countries have gotten rich, countries like South Korea, countries like Japan, certainly places like Taiwan, we've seen a lot of countries have gotten rich as a result of industrialization, as a result of pursuing as a result of actually trying to provide a service that's less expensive compared to the developed world. Unless you're Middle Eastern countries and you've just got tons and tons of oil, then a lot of other countries have tried to do it a different way. And I think we shouldn't malign that process because it's people trying to make a living. And if you ask a lot of people who have come out from the Chinese countryside, gone into the cities and taken up all these very difficult jobs doing back-breaking work, many of them would still prefer to do that than to go back home to the farm and and sort of stare at a future that's much less promising. So I think with that said, I would say two more things. One is that there's a lot that American companies can do to make sure that labor standards are better, that employees are, there are all kinds of standards that Western companies sign up to abide by, and that they, promise that they would make sure that their contractors abide by what those conditions too. And so if in fact many of them do that, then, you would still have Chinese laborers being paid much less than we are, but then you would most likely see fewer of the life-threatening circumstances. And the second thing I would say is that this also means that we can do our part here in the U.S. to get rid of a lot of the cumbersome regulations. Certainly after breathing in the polluted air in China, maybe one would be less antagonistic toward environmental regulations here in the U.S. But there are lots of regulations that small business owners here in the U.S. or big business owners complain are detrimental to job growth and so on. And I think we should do our best to find ways to make our market more competitive and to find ways to help our businesses create jobs. Yes, sir. Did you have a question? I do not. I was lucky for that.
One other question I was curious about, wasn't it about 5 or 6 years ago the Chinese government moved 1.5 million people when they built that dam over there?
The Three Gorges Dam. Yes, they did move a lot of people. A lot of ancient relics were destroyed. A lot of villages were destroyed. People were told to get out because we need to flood your area, at your village or your city. And so if you don't get out, you're going to be flooded. And so lots of people had to move. And that's another example of the kind of big infrastructure project that the Chinese government can take on that we simply can't do here. You know, because they don't really need to worry about all these people whose lives will be affected, and they can't vote for you anyway. They can't throw you out of office. So if you decide that this dam is your national priority, then you go and pursue all the policies that are necessary to make this priority come true. What's ironic is that the dam actually now has a lot of problems. They range from engineering problems to environmental problems, and I read recently that scientists suspect that the dam has also led to a number of really drastic earthquakes in China, just as a result of the economic. I don't really know the science behind it, but I think it's a result of the way that the dam was built, that it's affected. It's affected the fault lines or whatever it is, and I don't have any proof. It's just that scientists have been suggesting that it's quite possible that that's led to all these really awful earthquakes in China that we've heard about in recent years. So I think that was the last three questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ying, and thank you all for coming here tonight to hear her speak about her life experience and her perspective on the world. And we will have, I think we have coffee set up. We're going to have some goodies out here in a little bit. And she'll be here to continue answering some of your questions, signing your books. There's a table in the back. If you do not have her book, Chinese Girl in the Ghetto, you can purchase one back there. Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.